Mario is everywhere. He's likely the single most well-known character seen in gaming to date. Posters, merchandise, TV shows, movies, figurines, you name it. There's a Mario of it. And of course, the most important and where it originated, you can be sure to find video games with him front and center on the box. Perhaps what's most surprising is that Mario's popularity is still high even decades later. Yet, like any great success story, Mario had its own origins too. In the early 80s, arcade games were all the rage. Some would even go on to be hugely successful franchises. As many well-known franchises as there are in the gaming industry from this era, none is as prolific or successful as Mario. More than 600 million copies have been sold in the franchise across no fewer than 200 games. With an estimated revenue at above $36 billion, this makes it one of the highest-grossing media franchises of all time. Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Would originally be released to arcades, but later be ported to the Famicom, known as the NES outside of Japan. The inventive designer of these games, Shigeru Miyamoto, would work on many more games after this. His blockbuster hit would release in 1985, however, Super Mario Bros., a game that would grow into the most massive franchise in Nintendo's seemingly limitless catalog. Yet, as giant as this series has become, it, like any great work of art, has been embroiled in its own hardships. As the many games of the early to mid-80s were developed, many issues arose from technical limitations that are no longer too cumbersome today. Whether it be characters, items, or removing the capability to show two players on a single screen, sacrifices had to be made to accommodate the Famicom hardware. During this time, Miyamoto led a team of only about 7 programmers and artists to turn his ideas into what would become a monumentally historic feat, and in less than a year. As we know it today, this ambitious project would in fact be built into a game. Yet, even Miyamoto himself likely had no clue of the shockwaves he would inadvertently create for the gaming industry decades later. As unprecedented as the Super Mario franchise would become, it, too, started only as an idea. To explore this idea in more detail, this is the development history of Super Mario Bros.
I'm here with Steve Russo, who's the creator of the very first video game. How you doing, Steve?
Well, I have a little problem with first, because there were games on computers before Space War.
What is the first video game? It's a more widely contested topic than one might expect, but Space War is probably the most widely recognized as such. Even if not the first video game, however, it was certainly an important one, as it inspired the first 2 commercial arcade games in 1971, Galaxy Game and Computer Space. Following these would be the truly successful Pong in 1972. The gaming industry entered what's commonly referred to as a golden age in 1978 with the release of Space Invaders. From here, many competitors would try to get in on the action. One of these would be a little-known company at the time, Nintendo. During the middle of the so-called Golden Age, they would first see major success in the form of Donkey Kong in 1981. The mastermind behind this game would be none other than Shigeru Miyamoto. After making a couple of sequels to Donkey Kong, Miyamoto would start working on a new game. He would rework the player character Jumpman. From this point onward, he was Mario, and Mario was to be given a brother, and his name was Luigi. Titled Mario Brothers, the first player plays as Mario, a character who can fall from any height unharmed. The goal in this game is to eliminate creatures emerging from sewers. Even as a 2-dimensional game, it's crude by today's standards. The screen doesn't scroll, the background is black, and gameplay is slow. In the context of 1983, however, it works. And more importantly, it's fun. It would be successful too, even if not hugely so, and Miyamoto would go on to work on many more games after this.
Nintendo.
Have you ever heard of Nintendo?
No? Let's see.
I think it's something in Japanese.
Nintendo is something that started in Japan and has taken America by storm.
A hugely successful home console would release in Japan only one day after Mario Bros. Release. This was Nintendo's own game console, the Famicom. It would later be released in North America, Europe, and Australia. It would be known as the Nintendo Entertainment System in those regions, abbreviated as the NES, but in the meantime, Nintendo would be hard at work developing games for this system. For years, Miyamoto was doing all the design work by himself, but that would change partway through while working on a game exclusively for the Famicom. Game designer Takashi Tezuka joined the team during this time in 1984, and Miyamoto realized that having another designer on the team would be a big help to him. The game they were working on would have quite a large character at the top of the screen, and the game would be known as Devil World, released in October of 1984. Also in 1984, Miyamoto worked with a programmer from the Systems Research and Development team, Toshihiko Nakago. They would go on to develop a game that's much more widely recognized than Devil's World, and includes a prominently used scrolling screen. Excite Bike, a motocross racing game, would release in November of 1984, and very well received overall. Takashi Tezuka would be shown the sales figures for the original Mario Bros. On the Famicom. Seeing how it had sold consistently well, he approached Miyamoto and he responded by saying, "Mario seems like the way to go." Miyamoto and Nakago would work on 2 games simultaneously with the same staff. These games would eventually turn into Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. One end result from this is that bars of fire are used in both games. Originally used in Zelda, the team thought it would work better in Super Mario Bros., and so they transferred them across games. For the very start of Super Mario Bros. Development, Miyamoto wrote some test specifications in December of 1984. He wanted to see what it would be like with a double-sized Mario jumping around, and the first thing he told Nakago to do was to make a test version of the game with a large character that's capable of jumping around. Due to this, a normal-sized Mario didn't even exist in the first prototype of Super Mario Bros. Instead, it was actually a square, and the prototype had a black background, but it seemed satisfactory to Miyamoto at the time. Beyond this basic gameplay, the team needed to think of more to come out with a fun game. Original design documentation mentions of using rockets in the air, and concept art suggests Yoshi may have been planned to be in the game. While the reason behind why they weren't included in the game is unknown, it could likely be due to technical limitations, or the team's lack of familiarity with the Famicom hardware. The team also originally thought about having a shoot-'em-up stage, where Mario's on a cloud and shoots at enemies. This would be dropped, however, to focus more on action-oriented jumping. Action-oriented, athletic jumping, and running. This would be the central focus for Nintendo's next big game. After experimenting with what would become the basis for The Legend of Zelda, Miyamoto's team started writing specifications for Super Mario Bros. After being pressured by Nakago to settle on making something after seeing successful movement in the December test. Miyamoto and Tezuka went to work drawing the levels on huge sheets of graph paper, and Nakago's team would have to painstakingly enter the data by hand. This wouldn't start coming together much until the upcoming February of 1985. Even this early on, one can see both kinks being worked out as well as unique decisions being made for the game. These February specifications referred to enemies as just obstacles instead of enemies, monsters, or creatures. This was mostly as a habit from making Donkey Kong, a game using primarily obstacles. Another oddity came in the form of implementing the game's audio. Normally when developing a game, the developer wouldn't put in the sound until about a month before completion, but this game was different. For Super Mario Bros., the team decided to put some sound in the early stages, even if only as a placeholder, to ensure the CPU would keep up with demand throughout the whole development process. This is where musical composer Koji Kondo comes in. Impressed with Kondo including a song for Devil World's bonus screen, Miyamoto appointed him to sound for Super Mario Bros. As he thought Kondo was fit for the job. A core theme for creating this game was to have land, sea, and sky to make up the stages of the game. Partway through making the levels of the game, the team initially gave up on having sky levels due to memory constraints. This would be re-examined later on in development. But until then, the team still needed to implement a basic prototype that at least had a sky, greenery, and clouds. Nakago later states that he sensed the game had started to become something amazing when working on the background. While trivial to pull off in the industry today, black backgrounds were the norm in the early 80s, but Super Mario Bros. Would include a blue background to represent a sky. Even though nothing would be displayed at this point besides the blue sky, white clouds, and the ground, Nakago states it really jumped out to him as he thought to himself, "This is incredible." Surprised the Famicom could manage to display such vivid graphics, he'd never seen anything like it before and called Miyamoto immediately, telling him they had come up with something amazing. Yet, none of this would matter without at least moderately lengthy gameplay, surely. Right from the start, Miyamoto wanted to make a single level last for approximately 1 minute of the character going from the first screen to the end of the level. Surprised by this, Nakago was under the impression that it would take about 60 screens to pull that off considering how fast the player can move. Though only a sky, clouds, and the ground would be shown, Miyamoto likely understood that obstacles, blocks, and enemies would end up having a large impact on the time it takes to get to the end of the level. When Nakago's team actually created the levels, they often only needed around 12 screens or so. When they would finish a level, they would burn the data onto ROM, and both Miyamoto and Tezuka would play through the level. Whenever a change was needed, Nakago's team would receive notes stating what was needed, and they would sometimes spend the entire day poring over the notes and making even a single change. When creating the characters, Mario was perhaps the easiest of the bunch to make. Not only was there an already existing game to look at, but Miyamoto had been drawing Mario for quite a while up to the point of development, so he knew what he wanted Mario to look like. The priorities for Mario were simple: make the gameplay entail athletic jumping, and make his character model large. The latter seemingly presented a problem, however, as the team wanted to see farther ahead in the levels. The team could pull the camera back for a broader view, but then Mario himself would appear smaller. Nakago suggested that maybe it would be fun to have both, a large Mario and a small one. Thus, the team decided that you'd lose a life if the smaller Mario runs into an enemy, but Mario would only get smaller if he's large when hit. Musical composer Koji Kondo mentions of having played the game since these early experimental stages. He states that the game made a strong impact on him when he first saw the player character moving around in the world, and was bigger than any other he'd seen prior. As far as creating the music and sounds that would match, it was easy for him to imagine what the underwater music should sound like, so it was the first song he finished. After that, he made the above-ground music, and the first version actually didn't go over well. While it matched the theme present from the blue sky and greenery in the background, it didn't match the rhythm of Mario's fast-paced running and jumping. After actually playing the early versions instead of matching to how the game looked, he created the current above-ground music heard in the game today. While the plans were set for Mario at this point, making the antagonist of the game wasn't nearly as quick or easy for Miyamoto. First off, he didn't draw Bowser much, and mentioned struggling when getting the lines to come together right. Taking inspiration from Toei Animation, specifically through Alakazam the Great, he liked how the ox looked, and that's how he imagined Bowser. His drawings didn't quite line up with that idea, however, and when Takashi Tezuka saw Miyamoto's work, he thought it was supposed to be a turtle. Miyamoto later stated that he'd been drawing something completely incomprehensible, a turtle's body with an ox's head, and laughs at this recollection. Eventually, it was agreed upon to meet somewhere in the middle to create an interesting but ultimately well-made enemy. As for other enemies, in the original Mario Bros., the turtle enemies of the game were called shell creepers, and you could only first knock them off their feet and then make contact with them to deliver the final blow. Upon reflection, the team realized it made no sense that you could be killed when jumping on the top of the turtle's back before knocking them off their feet. Surely the turtles should come out worse from that encounter. The team then decided that if they made another Mario game, they would have it so you could jump on the turtles without dying. So, for Super Mario Bros., they did exactly that. The main enemy the player would likely encounter throughout development stages were Koopa Troopas. In fact, Goombas, as prevalent as they ended up being for the game's release, would be made at the very end of development. Koopa Troopas were often tricky for new players due to requiring multiple steps to eliminate them. After much testing, the team realized that an enemy that only walked would be more natural to introduce the new players to the game. Level design for Super Mario Bros. Was made much like how Koopa Troopas and Goombas were made. The first worlds created were actually not the introductory ones, but instead were actually Worlds 3 and 5. They were often the most fun for the programming team, but also proved to be far more difficult than what the first world should be. Beginners often had difficulties with them when testing it out. In fact, level 1-1 was made towards the end of development. Unlike now, where there are many predecessors to introduce the player, at the time of Super Mario Bros. Release, everyone was a beginner at the game. There were no strategy guides available at the time of the game's release, and players tended not to read the instruction manual or be told what to do. To get the player absorbed in the game in a natural way, the team designed its levels with a particular awareness that the player should become familiar with how things worked in Super Mario Bros. For instance, the mushroom is easily able to be gotten at the very start of the game. Even if the player doesn't acquire it immediately, the team positioned the very first pipe so that the mushroom hits it to bounce back to the player. Another example of the team making the game friendly to newcomers can be found in its sky levels. While the team had initially abandoned the idea of implementing one, Tezuka felt strongly about them being in the game, and the team managed to pull it off upon re-examination. The idea of traversing beanstalks into a sky level came from Tezuka himself and was inspired by Jack and the Beanstalk, a fairy tale that includes a boy who grows an enormous beanstalk reaching into the clouds using a handful of magic beans. In Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto ran with this idea to enact a feature where the player can hit a block to make the vine grow into the sky. A new problem presented itself from this, however. Mainly, how would you bring Mario back to the ground? While jumping would work, the team thought of this as unintuitive since, in the rest of the game, that's exactly what the player avoids because they lose a life if they jump down the screen. To solve this quandary, the team simply added a coin mid-air to entice the player. This requires some faith on the player's end, but as Nakago states in a later interview, the team can't betray the player's expectations. Therefore, if there are coins placed, you can surely collect them without harm. Not all accommodations were made specifically for the newcomers, however. Throughout Super Mario Bros. Development, Miyamoto states that, while the team attempted to pull in elements from a variety of games, the most important was perhaps Excitebike. The arcade version of the game had 3 levels the player could choose from to start playing because, as the team figured, people who were good at the game would want to start from the more advanced levels straight away. They thought it too impractical to allow the player to choose the last world straight away in Super Mario Bros. Yet, they thought it would still be nice if people who were good at the game could easily go from World 1 to World 8. This is where the idea of warps comes from. The player would need to just go through the short and easy areas to come across the first one and choose between 3 worlds. Clearly both, the designs of their levels, as well as the game as a whole, had much thought put into them. Much of Tezuka's work in particular seemed to have interesting level design and enemy placements. He'd anticipate how the player might play it and then, after making it, show it to Miyamoto for collaboration and fix anything that didn't feel right to either of them. As far as things that don't feel right go, bugs are typically among these. However, there are a couple of bugs that Miyamoto would let slide to further enhance the game. During development, once you hit a block with Mario, a coin is supposed to pop out and the block is meant to become unhittable. One time, for some reason, that didn't happen, and if you hit the block again, another coin came out. Miyamoto states that even though this should upset the rules and balance of the game, when you actually play it, the action becomes more pleasing. Therefore, the team made places where a bunch of coins would come out in a low spot, due to how fun it was to hit these blocks repeatedly and quickly. Another glitch would be found in the form of an endless looping water level in the US version of the game, while the Japanese version sends the player to a succession of 3 different levels. This would be dubbed the Minus World. While this is a bug and unintentional, Miyamoto's perspective is that it's essentially a feature too, since it doesn't crash or do anything detrimental to the game. Miyamoto states in a later interview that when you work solely from a paper plan, you tend to be hard on it and treat it like a stern father. Yet, as the game comes together, you gradually begin to treat it like a grandparent and think, well, if it makes the player happy, I'll give out as much candy as they want. While technical optimization is always a concern in development, the teams at Nintendo wanted to ensure Super Mario Bros. Would be incredibly optimized for the Famicom. As a result, many objects and sounds are reused in surprisingly inventive ways. For instance, the greenery and clouds are made from the same parts. The sound of Mario getting bigger is also the same sound for when he gets smaller, and is also the same for when he goes into pipes. Optimizations like this were not only necessary, but also fun for the team at times. If someone approaches a programmer stating they're having trouble because there's not enough memory, sometimes that was a way to show off what programming one can achieve at the team, attempting the same functions, but using a smaller amount of memory. Nakago mentions scrambling around for available memory as the team rapidly ran out, and Miyamoto demanded quite a bit. Kondo also required a decent amount for the ending song. The team would typically leave about 100 bytes as a precaution in case they encountered bugs that would need to be fixed. Yet, they were reaching the end of development for Super Mario Bros., and there didn't appear to be any bugs in testing, so they just used up the leftover space. After nearly everything was made and optimizations applied, there were still about 20 bytes left over. Miyamoto said, "Let's make a crown." From this, the team did exactly that, and resulted in a crown at the end of the game as a reward for players who acquired 10 or more extra lives. After nearly all was said and done, there were still 8 bytes left. Miyamoto, in a silly mood, told the team to just put in some more blocks and joked, "If any bugs show up, don't look at me." After all of this, the game would be fully developed and put onto cartridge format in August of 1985. It would be only 1 month later when Japan could first see the game that, little did they know, would impact the gaming industry for decades onward. Miyamoto started seeing how people were responding to the game and stated, "This is just like it was with Donkey Kong. This could turn out to be huge." As we know it today, Super Mario Bros. Wasn't just huge. There were still some interesting decisions made up to Super Mario Bros.' actual release date. Miyamoto was thinking about asking a professional artist or well-known illustrator to make the art for the game, but time was running out, so he drew the original art for the package himself. This is likely why there ends up being a pretty large deviation between the original art seen pre-release and art seen soon after the game's official release. September 13th, 1985. This would be when Super Mario Bros. Would hit store shelves in Japan. Fans from North America, Europe, and Australia would need to wait a little longer to get their hands on the game. The actual release date of Super Mario Bros. In the US would come soon after Japan's. Nintendo cites this as being October 18th, 1985 as a launch title alongside the NES. However, there doesn't appear to be any definitive proof of this for the game itself. In fact, it's actually uncertain precisely when Super Mario Bros. Released for the US. What? Detailed in a Gamasutra article in 2012, there are a few dates that could have been the actual release date for the game. While a filing with the US Copyright Office suggests an October 18th release date, there's no official recording of any sales or introduction of the game being alongside the NES debut in New York. One possibility is that the game had a ship date of October 18th, but a release date of November 17th, nearly 1 month later. This is what the Gamasutra article suggests, with a source uncited as they are believed to have collected this information from an internal database. After the North American release of Super Mario Bros., European and Australian fans would both receive the game in 1987. Looking back during an interview, Tezuka was surprised to see how many people from around the world would end up playing Super Mario Bros. To create such a popular game, much help came from development in Miyamoto's previous games, most notably Devil World and Excitebike. Experienced from creating Devil World's large character, that experience was a big help for the team in making a large Mario. The experience from scrolling the screen in Excitebike also helped in making the very same function for Super Mario Bros. Miyamoto states that Super Mario Bros. Was supposed to be a grand culmination of all NES cartridge games up to that point. Being 1 year prior to the Famicom's Disk System's release, the team intended for it to be the last game they would release on cartridge.
Todo despeinado porque no me dio tiempo nada ponerme la chancla y el bañador. Voy a la playa, había subido la marea.
Miyamoto wanted to put in as much as possible that would make people think thoughts like, Nintendo sure does know cartridges, and how did they do that? While the intention was to make Super Mario Bros. The last major cartridge release in anticipation for the Famicom Disk System, the Disk System didn't end up being successful for very long. It sold well in Japan for a while, jumping the 2 million units sold mark by the end of 1986, which was also the same year it released. This momentum wouldn't keep going for long, however, as the fragile discs would often be made unplayable due to a lack of shutters, a decision made to reduce costs. Combine this with rampant piracy of discs, as well as major developers refusing to produce games for the system due to Nintendo's strict licensing terms, and it creates a perfect storm that leads to the system's downfall. Even with the Disk System's downfall, however, Nintendo would push on to make many more games, including, of course, Mario games. With the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 and World in 1988 and 1999 respectively, Miyamoto mentions of an almost obsessive idea that arises. If he and the team don't add new elements, fans of previous games won't be satisfied. Due to this, Tezuka started implementing minigames such as roulette in these Mario entries. There was a time after this, however, that Miyamoto had to put a ban on minigames, so the team never had to rely on them to make the core gameplay fun. By 2005, the game's 20th anniversary, it would receive no fewer than 8 ports. As we know it today, Super Mario Bros. Was immensely successful and popularized side-scrolling platform games. In the Super Mario series alone, there would be 31 entries made all the way up to 2019 with the release of Super Mario Maker 2. When asked how he makes the Mario games, Miyamoto states that they're thinking the games up as they go, and he can only really answer what makes each game different. He comments, "The easy thing about making them is that they naturally change alongside the technology. As the tech advances, so too do the Mario games change alongside it, and because of this adjustment, he doesn't think he could have stuck with the series for this long if it weren't for them." Reflecting upon his amicable relationship with the rest of the team, he mentions that they've been together making games for so long likely because, while their opinions often differ, it never drags on. He suspects it to be like a symbiotic relationship, where they think they should let each other thrive with their own ideas, because it works out to everyone's benefit as a whole. Even 35 years after the release of Super Mario Bros., the series is still quite alive and well. Tezuka thinks the series has stayed popular precisely because they've preserved the original foundation, and states, "The pleasures that human beings get in seeking fun are concentrated in the Super Mario Bros. Games. Even when the times change and a new installment comes out, the visuals change and music becomes richer, but the basic fun elements of play can still be found in each game." Nakako mentions that while there are a lot of different kinds of video games, he feels that Super Mario Bros. Is its own genre. Not that it's just side-scrolling action, but he feels that it constitutes its own genre, and if it didn't, it too would get old. While the sheer quantity of Super Mario games makes innovation a seemingly impossible task, Nintendo has been doing so for 35 years now. Whether or not this novelty will eventually wear off is unknown, but no matter what the future holds, saying that Super Mario Bros. Has revolutionized the gaming industry is likely an understatement. Nothing can take that away from Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, or anyone at Nintendo who helped develop the game. What the team has achieved is a truly incredible accomplishment. It invigorated gaming as a whole for years to come, and hopefully I've shown you how the team managed to pull off this tremendous feat in gaming's history. Thanks for watching.